So welcome to this UR 2020 session on infrastructure risk modeling. So before I start, I would like to say that we are recording this session. We'll aim to treat every comment that's being raised anonymously, unless you state otherwise. And we'll also ask you, if you're interested to participate later on in this discussion, to email me any comments or issues or things that have popped into your head later on. You can email them to me afterwards, and of course that also will be treated anonymously if you wish to. So what will the remaining 15 minutes of the session will be about? So in this session, we will present some of the latest state-of-the-art in infrastructure risk models and decision-making for infrastructure investments. And we'll discuss through 3 presentations, and I will introduce the speakers in a minute. We'll discuss what we believe are some of the main applications, gaps, and opportunities in the field of infrastructure risk modeling and decision-making for infrastructure investments. And in this session, we really particularly want to highlight the importance of taking a more systemic approach when you look at infrastructure risk modeling and really consider these cascading effects and interdependencies, but not just within and between infrastructure systems, but also towards society. As we know, when an infrastructure asset fails, either an electricity substation or a telecommunication tower, it never is just the damage to that specific asset. There are cascading effects within its own system, and there are cascading effects to other systems. And in particular, Raghav Pan from the University of Oxford will show you what type of models we're using to try to quantify these impacts. And then do we have this very explicit relation to COVID-19? Well, in particular, the last year, we really see how these large-scale unexpected disruptions really affect infrastructure use and how we have to deal with future investments. I think an easy example is our use of the transportation system. We are pretty much not using our airports like we used this time last year. So how does that then affect the way we have to invest in future infrastructure? The way we are dealing with it now is if we want to build an airport or expand an airport, that's based, of course, on historical numbers and current day use. But can we still use these historic and current day numbers when we have these complex, unexpected events happening? How should we treat and deal with them within our risk models? And if we then treat these unexpected events, how can we then say something about investments? And if we say something about investments, how can we do that then in a very sustainable manner? And in particular, this sustainable manner is also something that Scott will talk about. Scott Tecker, infrastructure specialist at UNOPS. And in particular, this relation to this unexpectedness and complexity of systems is something Juliette Meehan will talk about. She's the deputy director of the Resilience Shift. So we really want to highlight that it's not just a different use of a single network that we see, but also really a shift between networks. So we do now see there is less pressure on the passenger transportation network, but as we are here now all together on Zoom, there is of course much more pressure on telecommunication. So if we are within a country, think about future investments in infrastructure, how are we going to prioritize our investments towards the future given these unexpected events? So the aim of this session is to write an opinion piece based on the main conclusions and presentations of our 3 speakers, but really also about some of the things you say as the audience. So because the time is limited and there's really not much room for a long discussion, we will in a minute ask you a few questions through Mentimeter. Then we'll have the 3 presentations, and then we'll ask 3 more questions again through Mentimeter to see how your opinion may have changed based on the presentations, how you are experiencing risk modeling in the situation of COVID-19. And based on your output from the Mentimeter and based on the presentations, we invite at the end a very small discussion that we can also use again then within our opinion piece. So again, afterwards, really feel free to contact us if you have more input you want to provide. And again, this can be either anonymous or by name, whatever you prefer. So now I will ask Theo to put up the Mentimeter and for you to answer these 3 questions. So you can just use your phone or the browser. I'm sure by now you're very much used to the Mentimeter. Go to menti.com and use the code in the above the question, and then you will be directed to the questions. So there's a little bit of a mix, but we do primarily have academics among us, hopefully applying risk models themselves and have some good ideas on how to move forward. So we're very much interested also while listening to the presentations, if you actually are working with risk modeling yourself already now. And maybe later on at the session, it's interesting to hear if you are thinking also of in the future applying some of these frameworks in your decision making or your own disaster risk modeling. Oh, and I would like to emphasize, if you have any questions during the presentations, it would be great if you just drop them in the chat, and then we can refer back to them during the little discussion we have. And I will ask you to speak out the question out loud, and then the speakers or me can respond to that. And particularly this point on the biggest gaps in infrastructure risk modeling, I mean, it's a difficult question to just answer maybe out of the top of your head, but it is something we really want to grasp and know what to work on in the upcoming years or prioritize. So later on, I might be curious what other risk drivers mean, but we can discuss that maybe later. I like the point raised about communication. It's always a bit difficult with something we struggle with. If we are working with these complex models, we often have thousands of results with bounds and standard deviations and mean and max, like what is the result the policymaker may be interested in or the practitioner. They often want one number, but given this uncertainty and complexity, we cannot just give one number. Or as an academic, we feel bad about giving this one number, knowing the uncertainty around it. All right. Thanks. This is, given the time, this is very nice. I would like to ask Raghav to start his presentation. Raghav Pant, researcher at the University of Oxford.
Thank you, Elko. And yeah, let me just start. Hopefully this works. I've now shared my screen and I'm hoping that everybody can see it.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you very much. And in the limited time that I have, this is a whistle-stop tour of some of the infrastructure risk modeling work that we have been doing at Oxford within our group. And just to kind of give you an overview about what kind of infrastructures we look at energy, transport, water, waste, telecommunications networks. In this presentation, I'll focus mostly on our transport work. And I guess one of the things to understand in this whole kind of risk modeling is that when we talk about networks, I mean, networks are have these cascading effects because of which a disruption at a local scale propagates to wider scales and creates these large socioeconomic disruptions. And one of our main focuses has been this whole question of understanding direct and indirect risks of network disruptions. In our experience, most of the work is done on the direct risk assessment side of things. Very little is done on the indirect risk assessment side of things. And we have also now worked a lot with governments and policymakers in trying to understand that once you know what your risks are, how do you come up with resilience options and interventions to prevent and reduce vulnerabilities and risks? And then as a large scale infrastructure network operator at a national scale, you'd have limited budgets. So what is the way of prioritizing the resilience interventions to improve the network performance? And all of this is mainly embedded within a system of systems approach, as we call it, because I mean, infrastructures, networks do not exist as silos and they're connected with each other. So we try to build these models of connected electricity, transport, water, waste, and other systems. We've published a lot of our work on the theoretical basis of what I'm talking about. And there's a lot of academic publications. If you're interested, then I can share with you after this talk. But the main point is that along with these theoretical models, we also our work is very implementation focused. And this is kind of mainly one of the kind of framework and action slide where I've tried to capture probably 10 slides in one slide over here. But what we essentially do, for example, in one of the studies we did in Vietnam with the World Bank on transport, we collected a lot of hazard data, which we don't develop ourselves, but there are several global models now from which you can obtain any kind of, for example, global flood models have created flood maps, which we use at different return periods under different climate scenarios. Most of our focus is on this box, which is network data and flow modeling, where we collect a lot of open source or even within country with government's data on transport networks. For example, this is a road network representation within Vietnam. And then we also collect information on how to map flows on the networks and try to understand where things are going, how things are going, what are the patterns of both travel of people and freight, which is a big focus of our work. And then we also collect some information on types of adaptation options in terms of, like, for example, in Vietnam, we looked at roads, things like how much would a climate resilient road cost and what would be the design of a climate resilient road. And the analysis bit is first taking hazards and networks and combining them together, intersecting them and identifying locations of risks and vulnerabilities. And this is kind of the classical probabilistic fragility-based analysis that is done. And then this is combined with the flow modeling, where you kind of simulate failure scenarios. Once you've done identified your vulnerable network assets, then you see what happens if a road is damaged and disrupted. What are the flows in the network that are disrupted because of that can create economic losses due to rerouting your transportation. And also because some of the transportation cannot be rerouted and there are these economic supply chain losses. So we kind of try to quantify all of that. And that is what comes out as the risk side of things. And that is also what is highlighted as the benefit side of things of avoiding risks. Because when you make an adaptation investment, what you're trying to do is you're going to avoid risk. So when I say benefit over here, I mean avoided risk. And then you have a cost associated with an investment. And subsequently, you have a cost, you can find a cost benefit ratio and identify at the asset or the network scale at individual road scales, where are the most vulnerable roads and where are the most cost beneficial investments that you need to make. And this is also kind of embedded within uncertainty analysis that Elko was referring to, because yeah, of course, none of this is we can claim is one number estimate. Moving on quickly, we've done these kind of studies, as I said, in transportation in different countries. With the World Bank, we published this report in Vietnam, which was, this whole analysis was meant to advise the Ministry of Transport and the government in Vietnam how to estimate the scale of economic losses due to transport disruptions, and also use that in scale of to understand the scale of investments that will be needed in their NDCs when they prepare for the next round of climate adaptation investments. We've done similar work in Tanzania and in Argentina, and what you see over here, 3 maps which highlight similar problems of most vulnerable roads within the countries, identified in terms of the highest risks that are seen. And then this is combined with estimations of investments that can be made. And the point or takeaway over here is this is an identification based on understanding the economic linkage, economic flows that are disrupted. So this is the whole indirect loss, a bit of things that I was talking about. Where we are taking this forward from a policy making point of view, which is kind of working with governments and stakeholders to translate all of this analysis into some sort of web-based visualization tools. This is a link for a web-based tool we developed in Argentina, which is open source, and you can kind of look at the code base in GitHub. Of course, the data is not shared, but what this does is like this gives an evidence of like you can click on a road, on an individual road in a country and identify all its properties and its risks that we have calculated before, and then identify resilience or adaptation options and identify the cost benefit ratios. All of these calculations are done within the tool. So this kind of is kind of a resilience prioritization and first order screening tool, as I call it, that helps people do detailed site investigations afterwards to identify and narrow down the possibilities of locations where investments need to be made. And this is very important also for disaster risk finance, which is something that I've not gone into details over here, but this is something that is where we are taking all our work, because all of this has to be tied into knowing how much is the scale of disaster risk financing that has to be made. And the where are we taking this further is that we live in a world today where data is becoming more and more easy to generate, I would say. I mean, there's still, of course, a lot of gaps, but lots of progress is made in creating these global generalizable data sets, which we try to incorporate in our work, through which we can kind of upscale all of these models at the global scale as well, what I presented at national scale. Just a last slide, another kind of further development, as I talked about all the different infrastructures and networks and things. So beyond transport, we've also looked at other infrastructures within the UK, within New Zealand, in China, and these kind of maps, which are like called hotspot maps, they highlight at some higher administrative level or for some clusters of infrastructures which are very vulnerable and which introduce a lot of risks within a country, which helps stakeholders further make decisions in terms of especially national planners in countries to see where are the vulnerable hotspots and where the investments need to be made. So with that in mind, I will kind of stop over here, and given the limited time, I hope you understood all of it. And if you haven't, then please, I'm happy to correspond. And thanks a lot for your time and attention. Over to you, Elko. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Raghav. Yeah, Scott, if you can continue this. So any questions to Raghav? We have some time at the end to raise them. And indeed, Raghav is very easily approachable for further questions later on.
Great, thanks very much. Can you see the screen and hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So thanks very much, Elko, and thanks to everyone for being a part of this session. It's a great pleasure to be speaking with you. And I'll be presenting work from UNOPS, United Nations Office for Project Services, which will take a slightly higher level look around the importance of infrastructure and infrastructure decision making at this time, in particular to ensure that we make good choices that help us steer infrastructure in the direction of sustainability and, of course, resilience. This is really driven by our understanding and a growing global understanding of the importance of infrastructure for development. Looking at that in relation to a couple of the global agendas, we see that infrastructure is completely influential for the Sustainable Development Goals. A piece of research that we published a couple of years back now in Nature Sustainability highlighted that infrastructure, when thought of quite broadly, can influence 92% of the 169 targets of the SDGs. So it has a really profound impact on the SDGs. We also know that it has a really high impact on climate change in our response to it. From the perspective of mitigation, infrastructure is responsible for the majority of greenhouse gas emissions, and indeed for the majority of expected and forecast future adaptation costs. And that's really important because it shows that infrastructure isn't just something kind of boring and something in the back room, but that is actually really at the forefront of driving national development agendas for countries. And that's important because we are today developing more infrastructure and at a faster rate than ever has been seen on the planet. And over the coming decades, we're set to spend trillions more. And in the context of COVID, many governments around the world will be looking to accelerate infrastructure investment as a way to stimulate economic growth and create jobs for people. But of course, this increase of investment is good. It provides people basic services, affords them human dignity in a number of areas. But there's a risk, a massive risk here that the investment can lock in unsustainable patterns of development that could influence society, the environment, the economy. But of course, coupled with that risk is an opportunity that if we make infrastructure choices well, if we ground these in the best kind of evidence around risk and resilience planning, around sustainability, that we can actually accelerate our transformation of societies towards more sustainable and resilient equivalents. And so that's really the big idea that drives us within UNOPS, and indeed a large collaboration that we have with Oxford, is to try to think through, well, how can we plan, deliver, manage infrastructure in such a way that we can accelerate this transition from where we are as a society today to being one in the future that is in alignment with Paris, so very low carbon or net zero carbon, and also pushing and promoting as many of the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals as possible. And because infrastructure is so influential, to understand what infrastructure do we have to do, where, when, how much of it, in terms of policies and investments in order to enable that future. We only have a small amount of time now, but I wanted to highlight just 3 slides from a study that we recently published back in October the 7th, which was a national infrastructure assessment that we performed and launched in October with the Prime Minister of St. Lucia. It's called the St. Lucia National Infrastructure Assessment, and we'll be able to provide a link for where you can download that study. That was with the Ministry of Finance and over 130 different stakeholders consulted and involved in pulling together this analysis. It's broken up into 2 main sections. I've got a slide on each of those, but which is, just to reiterate, just a small part of the work. One is around strategic long-term planning, which reflects chronic long-term risks that can be introduced in a country due to trends in economic behavior, in tourism, through population change and through long-term climate drivers. And the second part is around acute risks, which is the more kind of staple UR type risk of more related to climate shocks and climate hazards. So on the former, around long-term planning, here's just one slide to show the energy focus. This is a timeline from today, 2020 through to 2050. And there's a real chronic pressure in the country for tourism and population growth. and a need and a pressure from the outside to decarbonize the energy system due to volatility in fossil fuel prices. And this graph shows how, through a combination of demand-side policies for demand reduction, as well as renewable capacity interventions through time, the country can transition to a low-carbon economy within the energy sector that's in alignment with their NDC commitments and in alignment with several SDGs. From a climate adaptation perspective, again, just one view from a sectoral perspective here, showing how from the freight sector, what the geospatial hazard-related risks are around storm surge, flash flooding, for example, understanding here for 2 freight facilities in country. This is equivalent to just over half of the freight coming into St. Lucia, some $500 million worth of freight per year, and the benefits of adapting these sites to protect the value of that in economic terms, but also in terms of the socioeconomic development that those freight facilities can enable. Here we know that freight facilities indirectly support 75 SDG targets across a whole range of SDGs. So protecting these assets, adapting them to climate hazards, not only ensures that this freight is secure, not only ensures that this economic value is secured, but also ensures that development progress across multiple dimensions is safeguarded. Beyond this type of modeling, what we're most proud of in this study is around capacity development. We worked to establish a cross-ministerial infrastructure planning unit in the Ministry of Finance in St. Lucia. So this is a specific unit like the National Infrastructure Commission in the UK or the National Infrastructure Unit in New Zealand. We built St. Lucia one within their government, and we trained them how to use these type of tools to continue a legacy of this type of planning into the future. And one part of that is the ability to run these tools in-house and update the conditions around the uncertainty of certain drivers like tourism, like population growth, which is of course incredibly important as we've seen with COVID. And we're working now to take that through from not only understanding what's a list of projects that they could bring in, but how indeed they can attract financing for them. So that's the current stage of the study there. Going into financing, understanding how, because we know there's a really large growth in sustainable infrastructure financing, how we can connect up these projects to specific funds that different funders provide. But now just onto my final slide, just a couple of conclusion points. That we know that infrastructure is central to development, and that's everywhere. We are all impacted and involved in trying to meet the SDGs and Paris Agreement. And that at the time of increasing infrastructure investment, in particular with the COVID recovery, there's a need for us to use the best evidence and tools to help inform infrastructure decision makers make the right choices about infrastructure. We present here just one snapshot of how one can work with governments, bridge the gap between academia and governments, and to assist decision making. But of course, a number of you are involved with different efforts, and there's a lot of good work out there. And the final point is really just to reiterate that with this, there's no time to waste. We're in the decade of action before the Paris Agreement and the SDGs should be completed. So it's great that we have a forum and a session like this and your participation. So thanks once again, because we need to next go from where we are now of good examples to be able to take that more broadly to scale. So thanks very much, and I look forward to the discussion and questions that follow.
All right, thanks, Scott. Juliette, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Elko. Thanks, Scott. I'm going to quickly apologize in advance because someone's just started drilling in the street behind me, which is one of the downfalls of the virtual presentations, but hopefully it won't be too disruptive. So my name's Juliette Mian. I'm the Deputy Director of an organisation called Resilience Shift. Our focus in Resilience Shift is around bringing theory into practice, creating a shift in the decisions people make around resilience, around resilient infrastructure. So I'm just going to sort of round off the two excellent discussions with a few sort of thoughts on how we can bring this risk modelling into practice to inform decisions. just very quickly to provide a quick overview of Resilient Shift, and I obviously could spend a long time talking about what's in this graphic. It's Resilient Shift on a page. We're a small organisation. We're supported by the Lloyd's Register Foundation and ARUP. And we're working sort of globally across the value chain for critical infrastructure. So our audiences range from policymakers, investors, through to engineers, owners, operators, and end users of infrastructure. Just wanted to reflect, and in light of the sort of framing and the title for this session, really where we were, what we thought about the world in January 2020, and what we think about the world now. And I'm sure everyone would agree, you know, there's a lot happened, there's a lot to reflect on. But the work that we had done over several years in Resilient Shift and working with many others globally, we knew, and we were really focused on the importance of whole systems thinking for solving infrastructure challenges. From work that we'd done, particularly in the water sector, but in multiple sectors, that the systems, it's not just the physical infrastructure systems, but fragmented governance and policy are a real problem, particularly in recovering from unexpected and catastrophic events. We've always been framing our work around deep uncertainty and the future uncertainty that's facing our infrastructure systems. And we'd also done a lot of work and engagement around tools and models that exist and the users of those tools and models. And one of the reflections sort of shown in the diagram on the right is there's quite a disconnect between those two groups of people. So something that we've been picking up and focusing on was how do we engage and have the potential users of these fairly complex risk models engaging with the developers of the tools. So again, in terms of the global trends that were, you know, driving our work, there is the significant urbanization and population growth, climate change and other planetary boundaries, digital transformation and globalization. So all of those clearly are still highly relevant. And I think to an extent, everything that has happened this year during COVID has proved some of what we've been saying about the big changes that are happening to our world, about the deep uncertainty of our future. Some of the consequences of things like urbanization and population growth, I think, are more evident than they ever were. And in terms of digital transformation, globalization, as Elko was saying at the beginning, the reliance that we have all had during the whole of 2020 on our digital networks is really clear. And again, work we'd done previously at the Resilient Shift, we always know how much we've always found how much there is to learn from crises and the experiences that people have had in crises. So this is just an example of day zero when Cape Town was facing its massive water shortage and the prospect of turning the taps off in Cape Town. And we'd worked hard during previous years of capturing the different experiences of different people from that particular crisis and found how much they support a lot of our narrative in our models, in the Resilient Shift, about uncertainty, about systems thinking, about the roles of humans in the system. So then just reflecting on what we've seen this year, and again, you know, Elko's picked up on this, and Scott also mentioned one of the big impacts of COVID is the recovery stimulus funding. But something that I found very interesting is with COVID, there's no direct physical impact on the system. So we've really seen the importance of humans in the system and the roles of humans in both the operating and using. So we've mentioned briefly already the massive change in demand for our transport networks, but also taking National Grid, and this was a case study from the US, but the same has happened in the UK, that grid has kept running by individuals in its critical operations team actually isolating for up to 6 weeks, taking themselves away from their homes and their families. So I think there's some really interesting aspects about we talk about socio-technical systems, but what we've really seen this year is quite how much we are interconnected with the humans in the system. And again, some work we did at Resilient Shift around leadership and the decisions that city leaders, business leaders have been taking in real time during the whole of the COVID crisis. The need to be adaptive, flexible, reactive, dealing with uncertainty, you know, almost on a daily basis. So again, I think that comes back to our point about governance and decision making, and what's happening in real time can really impact the resilience of our systems. So just reflecting on that, you know, everything that we were thinking about at the beginning of 2020 still applies. Nothing's changed. You know, the challenge is still there around whole systems approaches, fragmented governance, uncertainty, but also some of the points that have been really made evident during this year. The cost and the impact of not preparing for what, you know, arguably low probability but high impact events. All of us around the world have really relied on data and modeling, you know, as the general public looking at models and looking at pandemic models and looking at data on a daily basis like we never had before. As I already mentioned, the reliance on digital infrastructure has been completely, you know, highlighted, flagged up. This whole sort of global crisis would have been very different 20 years ago when we didn't have the technology and connectivity that we have now. And finally, the point I was making, we've really understood the importance of humans in the system. So finally, just to lead into the discussion, and I can see there's already been a few good questions coming up on the chat, but thinking about these models, which I do believe are really important to help decision makers, you know, do their jobs, but can they keep pace with the rate of change? We've really seen how uncertain things are, how quickly things are changing. These models that use so much data and, you know, really detailed models, how do we keep pace? Also, are we able to communicate this uncertainty and complexity? I suppose for me as a sort of practitioner end user, I sometimes worry that the models imply a confidence and a certainty by the fact that they have so much detail and sort of visual strength in them. And the final question, and again, anyone in the audience who's got views on this, you know, are the models meeting the needs of decision makers? Do we understand what decisions need to be made? And I think both Raghav and Scott talked about the National Infrastructure Commission in the UK and the equivalent in St. Lucia. So I think they are, but it's just a sort of open question for discussion, really. So thanks, Elko. I'll hand back to you.
All right, thanks, Juliette and Scott and Raghav. So before we open up the discussion, we would like to get as much as feedback from you as possible. So Theo will briefly share Mentimeter again, where we ask you to reflect on 3 points raised as well. Might be a difficult open question, but really throw in whatever thoughts you have and the things you have experienced over the past year. Perhaps this question is maybe a bit too much. Great. It's a good point to raise that COVID primarily also just underscores the existing challenges and shortfalls we already have. I agree with that. All right, maybe given the time, we'll just, thanks Theo, we'll just move on. And if you have any reflections on this, again, feel free to either put them in chat, email them. It's interesting to see the amount of maybes. I'm curious if maybe someone wants to, after our last question, want to reflect a little bit on their maybe. What is then, which parts may they be able to deal with and which not? It's at least positive to see that there's no. At least we yeah, it's very interesting to see. So I think we can all agree that engineers have pretty much dominated this field, but we do now see over I think primarily the last year or 2 years, we see that there's more shift also looking at infrastructure failure and infrastructure systems in relation to social equity and social vulnerability. And it's interesting to see that data is not the number one, which we always talk about. I'm curious if it's because it has always been an issue, so maybe we should just accept it and should focus on other aspects, or is it indeed not as important because we can? Is there already enough data? I don't know. It's curious to hear about that. All right, thanks, thanks Theo. Given the time, I guess it's good to go back. So thanks everyone for their input. There are a few points raised also in the chat. I'm not sure if Raghav, Scott, or Juliet may want to reflect on some of these points, or maybe Nicola, do you maybe want to further speak out loud your point?
Hi, sorry, I've been quite vocal on the comments. Hi, I'm Nicola. I work for the World Bank and Oxford actually as well. So I guess most of my points are around what we can learn from COVID, and certainly one of the things that we've observed. So I do a lot of work with particularly ministries of finance, is that so I actually don't agree with the comment that this is just about what we already knew and showing the vulnerabilities that we already knew. I think that this has shown us more, and it has shown us the systemic nature of risk. But I think it's also, we need to shift a lot from just thinking about the assets to thinking more broadly. and also thinking about more than just disasters that impact assets, but thinking about risk in a more integrated way. And I guess my final point there, which was about shock responsive systems, is just in recognizing that these infrastructure systems are not static, and it's not just about protecting infrastructure systems, but thinking about how they need to scale up in response to crises as well. If you look at the impacts of COVID in a number of countries, for example, across Africa, water systems have had to scale up significantly. That's had a very big effect on government in terms of the financial implications on government. Electricity networks have had to change, for example, relying actually in many cases now shifting more to renewables because of the shift in demand. So there's a lot of ways that I think systems have had to change and evolve. And so just pointing out that it's not just about protecting a system, which I think we also think about risk, but much more about how can we ensure systems are actually able to respond to crises as well. I'll stop there. Thank you for the interesting session.
Yeah, thanks, Nicola. It's a really good point that you raised, that we shouldn't just talk about fully protecting them, but also about responding to disruptions. And it's also what we see more and more in the academic modeling, that we really try to think about adaptive systems and resilient systems, and not so much as systems able to withstand everything. Maybe Juliet, do you want to respond on this?
Yeah, thanks, Elko. And I think just to agree with Nicola, really, and I think to take some positives from this, there's a couple of things, because we recognise that we needed to think about more than just protecting the assets, and that this was, we have to think about the bigger systems. I think what this year has done is given us the tangible examples for people, who maybe it's not an easy concept to understand, but now we've all lived through 2020, there's a lot of real evidence that matters to support some of the things that were maybe a bit abstract. And the other thing I think is really important, that what we have seen this year is that we can change when we need to. So that, there needs to be a motivation, but exactly as you were saying, Nicholas, so many systems have had to change very rapidly during 2020 that it's no longer justifiable to say this is too difficult, or here's all the barriers. We can do it when we have to. So looking forward,
shift is manpower.
Climate change, there's more that we can do. So some of the positives, I think, from that.
Yeah, thanks, Julian. And are there any other points people want to raise or reflect on? Now we still have a few minutes left to talk about this. Anna Laura? Oh, no.
Yeah, if I may add, one of the things that this year has definitely especially shown us is that when we do our modeling, sometimes we come up with these failure scenarios, and we say, like, what if something is shut down for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and we think like, oh, we've done a good job taking up these assumptions of long-term kind of 4 weeks, 5-week closures of things, and sometimes we come up with even like 2-month, 3-month closures of things, and we always used to think that, oh, that's not going to be realistic. Surely something will be done. And it turns out now we are actually living through a year where things have been shut down for months to no end. And yeah, so this is kind of, COVID has definitely presented us with concrete examples of failures can last long, or disruptions can last long realistically, and there are scenarios like that very much present in our world, and we are living through it.
Yes, no, agreed. Excellent point, Reg. I've also, indeed, when we think about disruptions, historic disruptions, also think about electricity or network failures have been a few days, and there have not been a disruption of systems of months or so. So that's very interesting what has been shown over the past year. Are there any points people want to raise before we pretty much have to close the session? Then I would just take the opportunity to just, thank everyone. Briefly show, show our contact details as well. So really just my email address here, and really if you think about maybe later today, you think a little bit longer about this, think about the complexities we've mentioned, the challenges ahead of us, thinking about how to communicate to decision makers. Do you feel like something that you have experienced is really a classic example on how to move forward? Really feel free to drop us an email, as the session is not just us communicating to you. In the normal UR 2020, we probably would have a double as long session with actual full-on discussions where we really want to get feedback from you. So really don't hesitate to contact us and think a bit longer about this topic. Maybe a final question by Shi Yu. How useful is complexity sciences and infrastructure disaster modeling? Raghav, do you want to briefly respond to that? It is pretty much built upon complexity sciences, I think.
I thought, Hilko, you'll respond to that yourself. But yeah, I mean, of course, I mean, this is very important complexity science models that not just, I mean, I presented network science models, but there are agent-based models and there are kind of several other branches of research. And they all have been, one of the things they have been doing, all these different modeling developments have been kind of showing different and innovative ways in which large data can be used. And then that is actually the key of people. And Juliet mentioned this point also of the key and importance of having more and more data to understand the problem and scaling it up to understand the systemic nature of risks. And that is what complexity models are very good at doing and have a lot of more scope for development as well.
If I might just quickly say something on that. Yeah, completely agreed that there's great scope for complexity modeling, and in particular taking some thinking from physics into the way in which we think about networks. But I'd also emphasize attention on the other side, from the government side of things, that it's really important to evaluate how decisions are currently being made in a context and on using what type of information, data and models in different governments to be able to understand then, well, how can we then as people with models then inform the type of decisions and processes that are going on within governments? Because often what we need to do is just improve the level of decision making. And we're often coming at this with incredibly sophisticated tools that often bamboozle decision makers. And what we need to do is to be able to think, what are the salient pieces of information that can actually transform a decision in practice? So I would encourage kind of exploration of the enabling environment and the context in which decisions are made, as well as coming from the kind of more physics complexity side of this. I think on both sides, they really have to come and meet in the middle. But it was a great discussion today. Thank you.
Thanks. Right, and I'll hereby also stop